Imagine it's July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy are thick with smoke and fear. Allied columns advance cautiously through the wreckage of French villages, convinced the worst is behind them. The Wehrmacht is retreating, its once mighty panzers burning on the roadside. Victory feels close enough to touch. Then, without warning, the sound begins. A low, metallic growl, deeper than any tank engine they've ever heard. It rolls across the fields like distant thunder. Soldiers freeze. Artillery crews glance toward the tree line. Something massive is moving out there. Through the haze, a silhouette emerges. At first, it looks like a regular Tiger, Germany's infamous heavy tank. But as it moves into view, the difference becomes terrifyingly clear. The turret is longer, the armor sloped and immense, the gun extending outward like a steel spear. Even at a distance, it radiates menace. A Sherman commander in the distance raises his binoculars and swears under his breath. "That's not a Tiger," he mutters. "That's something worse." The King Tiger had arrived, officially designated Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf. It was the final evolution of German armored warfare, a tank born from desperation, engineered to dominate, and destined to fail under the weight of its own perfection. In theory, it was unstoppable. Weighing nearly 70 tons, protected by frontal armor thicker than any Allied gun could reliably pierce, and armed with the dreaded 88mm K-43 cannon, a weapon capable of destroying enemy tanks from over 2 kilometers away, it turned every battlefield into its hunting ground. When it appeared, Allied morale cracked. Radio intercepts describe panic spreading through frontline units. Reports of super tanks, impervious to fire, shrugging off hits that would have shredded anything else. Crews spoke of seeing their shells bounce off like pebbles. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Soldiers began firing before even confirming a sighting. Airmen requested extra sorties to find and destroy the monsters hiding in the forests. Entire offensives slowed to a crawl because of rumors that one King Tiger could halt an entire column. Yet inside this steel colossus, the story was far more complex. The crews, mostly young men barely out of training, lived in a furnace of noise, fumes, and fear. The massive Maybach HL-230 engine roared behind them, straining to move 70 tons of armored ambition across narrow European roads. Every kilometer risked a breakdown. Every turn threatened to tear the transmission apart. But when the King Tiger worked, it was godlike. Allied tank crews compared it to facing a moving fortress. Its gun could punch through a Sherman's armor at ranges where the American shells would simply ricochet. Even Churchill tanks, symbols of British resilience, found themselves helpless under its fire. To Allied infantry, the sight of one emerging from the smoke was enough to scatter entire units. It wasn't just a machine, it was a message. The Reich still had teeth. The first time it appeared in Normandy, near Villers-Bocage, reports spread faster than the tanks themselves. Soldiers began calling them King Tigers before the name was even official, and like all legends, the myth grew faster than the truth. For the men inside, though, it wasn't legend, it was survival. Each engagement meant gambling everything on a few seconds of precision. One mechanical failure, one Allied aircraft overhead, and their invincible fortress became a burning coffin. The world saw the King Tiger as an unstoppable beast, but inside, its crew knew the truth. It was as fragile as the country that built it. The age of armored giants had arrived, and it was already dying. To understand the King Tiger, you have to understand Germany in 1943. The tide of war was turning. The Wehrmacht that once stormed across Europe was now fighting for its survival. On the Eastern Front, Soviet T-34s were rolling west in endless waves. In the West, American industry was flooding battlefields with Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them. The Third Reich's dream of dominance was slipping away, and Hitler's response was predictable. Build something so terrifying, so indestructible, that it would restore fear itself. He demanded a tank that could dominate any battlefield. Nothing less than absolute superiority would do. And so, the vision of the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf B, the King Tiger, was born. It wasn't designed by necessity, but by obsession. Hitler believed that technology could reverse the course of war, that German engineering could overcome sheer numbers. He wanted a weapon that embodied the might of the Reich, a tank that could stand against 100 Shermans and still move forward. Two giants of German industry competed to build this machine, Porsche and Henschel. Porsche's design looked revolutionary on paper: electric transmission, curved armor, futuristic control systems. But it was far too complex, unreliable, and expensive. When the prototypes broke down before even reaching the front, the contract went to Henschel. Their version, simpler but still monstrously advanced, was approved for production in early 1944. It combined lessons learned from the Tiger I and the Panther, wrapped in nearly impenetrable armor. The front plate alone was 150 millimeters thick, sloped at an angle that could deflect almost any Allied shell. At the heart of it was its weapon, the 88mm KWK-43 L-71 cannon, a longer, more powerful evolution of the already feared 88 used in the Tiger I. This gun could pierce a Sherman's armor at 2 kilometers, sometimes even 3, before the enemy had a chance to aim. The King Tiger's turret came in two main forms. The early Porsche turret, rounded and elegant, was visually striking but prone to ricocheting shells down into the weak roof armor. Later came the Henschel turret, more angular and practical, and this became the defining look of the beast. But behind this engineering marvel lay a fatal flaw. It was too ambitious for the Germany of 1944. The tank weighed 69 tons, so heavy that many bridges couldn't support it. Its Maybach HL-230 engine, designed for lighter vehicles, strained to move the mass. Even on good roads, breakdowns were constant. In muddy fields or snow, the tank could barely move at all. Crews often joked that it was safer to fight in a King Tiger than to drive one. A single mechanical failure could leave them stranded, and an immobile Tiger, no matter how powerful, was just a steel tomb waiting to be bombed. Still, when it worked, it was unmatched. On open ground, it was death incarnate. Allied tank commanders learned to fear the long silhouette of the 88mm gun emerging from the fog. Many chose to retreat or call in air support rather than face it head-on. To the German High Command, the King Tiger was a symbol. To the crews who served inside, it was a paradox, an engineering masterpiece trapped in a crumbling empire. Production began in February 1944 at Kassel under constant threat from Allied bombers. Skilled labor was scarce, resources dwindling, and quality control slipping. By the end of the war, only around 490 King Tigers were ever built, each one consuming enough material and labor to produce 5 Panther tanks or 20 Panzer IVs. It was the ultimate expression of Nazi Germany's late war mindset, a desperate pursuit of perfection when what they needed was practicality. The King Tiger was not just a weapon, It was a monument to ambition, arrogance, and the illusion of invincibility. And soon, it would be tested. Against overwhelming odds, on the plains of Poland, the forests of the Ardennes, and the ruins of Berlin itself, the beast would roar and then, inevitably, fall silent. Summer 1944, the King Tiger was finally ready for war. Its steel hulls, freshly painted in camouflage, rumbled out of German factories and onto the battlefields of a collapsing empire. Each tank was a masterpiece of engineering and a logistical nightmare. The first units to receive them were among the most elite, the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion on the Eastern Front, and later the Schwerpanzerabteilung 501 in the West. Their mission was simple: to turn the tide, to make the world remember that the German panzer arms still ruled the battlefield. On paper, they were unstoppable. In reality, their first deployment was a disaster. The Eastern Front, August 1944. Near the Polish village of Sandomierz, the 503rd Battalion rolled its new King Tigers into combat against the Red Army. But the terrain was a death trap. Soft soil, narrow roads, and endless mud. Within hours, several tanks broke down. Others sank into the ground, their 70-ton bodies swallowed by the Polish earth. When the Soviets counterattacked, the King Tigers were stranded. T-34s and Su-85s circled like wolves, firing relentlessly. Soviet gunners quickly learned to aim for the tracks or the thin-side armor. Even when they couldn't pierce the main hull, they immobilized the giants. Once stuck, the King Tigers became targets for artillery and airstrikes. One of the most infamous encounters came when a Soviet T-34-85 ambushed a column near Oguldow. The Russian tank fired from behind cover, hitting the first Tiger's ammunition. The explosion was apocalyptic. Within minutes, 2 more King Tigers were burning wrecks, all destroyed by a single nimble enemy tank. The Germans recovered what they could, but the legend of invincibility was already cracking. Reports to Berlin spoke of mechanical failures, bogged tanks, and burned-out hulks. But in propaganda reels, these losses were buried under footage of the Tiger's massive gun firing at distant targets. Still, even in defeat, the King Tiger left its mark. Soviet crews wrote in awe about its armor and gun, calling it a fortress that moves. In direct duels, the 88mm cannon tore through anything it faced. One King Tiger could hold off an entire Soviet column, if it had fuel, if it didn't break down, and if it wasn't outflanked. That was the paradox of the King Tiger, a tank built for open terrain, fighting in a war that had none left to offer. As the Eastern Front consumed more of Germany's strength, new King Tigers were sent west to face the Americans and British in Normandy. Allied intelligence first dismissed reports of new Tigers. But when reconnaissance photos revealed long shadows, longer than any tank they'd seen before, the alarm spread quickly. Sherman crews were briefed to avoid direct confrontation. In the narrow French lanes, the King Tiger's power was both blessing and curse. It could destroy any Allied tank with a single shot, but it could barely maneuver through villages or hedgerows. Many were abandoned not to enemy fire, but to empty fuel tanks or shattered gearboxes. Yet when it appeared on the battlefield, it changed everything. In one clash near Sintho, a single King Tiger destroyed 14 British tanks in under 15 minutes before withdrawing unscathed. Even when outnumbered 10-1, the King Tiger could dominate. The Allies learned that fighting it wasn't just about tactics, it was about psychology. As one British soldier later recalled, "When you saw that long gun turning towards you, It didn't matter how brave you were. You prayed you weren't the one it chose. By autumn 1944, the myth of the king tiger had taken hold on both fronts. The Germans saw it as their last hope. The Allies saw it as the monster lurking in every forest. But behind the myth, a quiet truth was growing. For every king tiger that reached the battlefield, two never made it. Broken gearboxes, destroyed supply lines, and desperate shortages meant that this invincible tank was already running on borrowed time. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent under a blanket of snow until the ground began to tremble. Out of the white mist came the silhouettes of giants, king tigers, dozens of them, leading the spearhead of Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. To Allied troops, the sight was surreal. They had heard rumors of a new tiger, bigger than anything before. But nothing prepared them for the real thing. 70 tons of steel rolling through the fog, the 88-millimeter gun jutting forward like a spear of doom. In the forests of Belgium, the King Tiger became both weapon and legend. Its armor, 180 millimeters thick at the front, could shrug off any Allied shell. Shermans and Cromwells fired in desperation, watching their rounds bounce off like pebbles. Meanwhile, the Tiger's gun could destroy them from over 2 kilometers away. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion spearheaded the attack near Stavelot and La Glaise, under the command of SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. His armored column, including nearly 50 King Tigers, tore through the American lines in the opening days of the offensive. Town after town fell in chaos. Allied soldiers who'd survived the Normandy fighting suddenly faced a tank they couldn't kill. One American gunner later recalled, "We hit that thing 5 times, front, sides, turret, and it just kept coming. We weren't fighting tanks anymore. We were fighting monsters." The psychological effect was devastating. Entire infantry units abandoned positions when they heard the distinct thunder of Tiger engines approaching. Even before contact, the tank's reputation did half the work. But the same problems that haunted the Eastern Front followed the King Tiger west. Its massive weight tore up the narrow Belgian roads, bridges collapsed under its bulk, and its engines guzzled fuel faster than it could be delivered. At La Glaise, Peiper's column ground to a halt, not because of enemy fire, but because the Tigers ran dry. Surrounded by American armor and cut off from supply, the crews destroyed their own tanks to prevent capture. When U.S. troops finally entered the town, they found the frozen hulks of King Tigers abandoned in the snow. Mighty machines defeated not by guns, but by logistics, yet the damage had been done. Allied commanders admitted that the fear these tanks inspired had slowed their counterattack. The very rumor of a Tiger II in an area could tie down entire units. One captured German officer reportedly told his interrogators, "The King Tiger fights with 2 weapons, its cannon, and your imagination." And he wasn't wrong. On the open plains, a single Tiger II could dominate for miles. But the winter landscape was its enemy: narrow roads, dense forests, and ambushes waiting behind every bend. American bazooka teams and artillery learned to use terrain to their advantage, waiting for the Tigers to expose their sides or tracks. The Allies began calling airstrikes whenever a Tiger II was spotted. The 9th Air Force made it a priority target. For the first time, German tankers began to fear the sky more than the ground. By January 1945, the Great Offensive had failed. Dozens of King Tigers lay scattered across the Ardennes, burned out or abandoned. The survivors retreated east, leaving behind twisted wrecks that became trophies for advancing American troops. Still, the legend lived on. Even in defeat, the King Tiger's mere presence reshaped Allied tactics. Tank destroyers like the M36 Jackson were rushed forward, armed with 90mm guns just to stand a chance. Crews were trained specifically on how to flank and disable the Tiger II. The myth had outgrown the machine. For the Allies, the King Tiger was no longer just a tank. It was the face of German war power, the final embodiment of a regime that refused to surrender quietly. And for the men who faced it in those frozen woods, the sound of its engine would echo in nightmares long after the war was over. To understand the King Tiger, you have to understand what it meant to Germany in 1943. The Third Reich was bleeding on every front. Allied bombers darkened the skies. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and German cities were turning to rubble. But in the midst of this chaos, Hitler still believed in one idea, that a single weapon, a single Wunderwaffe, could change everything. The King Tiger was that dream made steel. Officially known as the Panzerkampfwagen, Tiger Aus B, it wasn't just an evolution of the original Tiger. It was a complete reimagining of what a tank could be. Engineers at Henschel were tasked with creating the ultimate armored vehicle, one that could withstand anything the enemy had while destroying everything in return. The result was a masterpiece of over-engineering, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly impractical. At its core lay the 88mm KWK-43L71 gun, an upgraded version of the weapon that had already made the WWII legendary. It could penetrate 150mm of armor at 2 kilometers, enough to destroy any Allied or Soviet tank before they could even fire back. Its frontal armor was sloped, inspired by captured Soviet T-34s. The hull could deflect most incoming shells, and the 185mm front plate was nearly impervious to any Allied gun. Even Soviet 122mm shells from the IS-2 often failed to penetrate it head-on. On paper, it was perfection. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. The tank weighed 69 tons, almost twice as much as a Sherman, and heavier than most bridges in Europe could handle. Its Maybach HL-230 P-30 engine, the same used in lighter Panthers, struggled to move the massive chassis. In mud, it could burn through a full tank of fuel in under 80 kilometers. In snow or rain, it could barely move at all. Mechanics nicknamed it Der Löwe, der nicht laufen kann, the lion that can't run. The transmission was fragile, the steering gears failed constantly, and the interleaved road wheels, though designed for smoother motion, clogged with mud and froze solid in winter. Crews spent more time repairing than fighting, but when it worked, it was unstoppable. German propaganda showed it crushing cars and walls. Soldiers stood proudly beside it, calling it unzerstörbar, indestructible. It became a symbol of defiance, a weapon meant to restore the myth of invincibility Germany had lost since Stalingrad. For many crews, the King Tiger inspired both pride and despair. They knew they commanded the most powerful tank on Earth, yet they also knew they could never escape once it broke down. One veteran said, "When you fought in a Tiger II, you felt like a god until you had to fix it." Its complexity made it nearly impossible to mass-produce. Each required over 300,000 man-hours, a staggering figure in a country short on labor and materials. Between May 1944 and March 1945, only 492 King Tigers were built, a tiny number compared to the thousands of Shermans and T-34s flooding the battlefield. Yet each demanded immense resources, 6 times the steel of a Panzer IV, double the fuel, and endless maintenance. In a war, Germany was already losing. Every one of these machines was a small act of self-destruction. By late 1944, Allied bombers targeted Henchel's Castle factory directly. Production slowed to a crawl. Crews were rushed to the front with little training, often driving their tanks straight off rail cars and into combat. The dream of a perfect war machine was collapsing under its own weight. The King Tiger was everything the Reich wanted to be: powerful, intimidating, unbreakable, and everything it truly was: overconfident, overstretched, and doomed. It wasn't just a tank, it was a metaphor carved in armor, ambition without balance. And as 1945 approached, even the men who built it knew no amount of steel could stop what was coming next. By early 1945, the King Tiger was no longer a symbol of power, it was a symbol of desperation. The Reich was collapsing. Soviet troops were closing in from the east, the Allies from the west. German cities were burning, fuel depots were empty, and yet the King Tigers still rolled out of the Henschel factory, one by one, like ghosts of a fading empire. Each tank that left Kassel was escorted by soldiers who knew the truth. It was already too late. The roads they traveled were littered with the wrecks of what came before: Panthers, Stugs, and the original Tigers, all left behind after running out of fuel or breaking down. The King Tiger was supposed to succeed where they had failed, but now it was just another giant being sent to die. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the King Tiger made its most infamous stand. December 1944, Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. More than 400,000 German troops were thrown into the offensive. Among them were the elite SS tankers of Kampfgruppe Peiper, driving King Tigers through frozen valleys and narrow roads meant for farm carts. To the Americans, these tanks seemed invincible. Artillery shells bounced off their armor like pebbles. Anti-tank rounds shattered harmlessly against their sloped steel. In some battles, a single King Tiger could hold up entire companies of Shermans, forcing U.S. troops to call in air support just to survive. But even in victory, the King Tiger was betraying itself. Their engines overheated, tracks snapped, gearboxes jammed in the cold. Crews abandoned tanks because they ran out of fuel, not because they were destroyed. Dozens were left behind intact, later photographed by stunned American soldiers. Pieper's men fought with ferocity, but without logistics, even the most powerful tank became nothing more than a steel coffin. As one German officer bitterly wrote, "We had the best tank in the world, but not a drop of fuel to move it." By February 1945, the Ardennes offensive had failed. Hundreds of German tanks were lost, including many King Tigers, either destroyed by their own crews or captured. From that point on, the mighty Tiger II was no longer an instrument of conquest. It was a relic, retreating with the rest of the army. In the East, the story was even worse. Facing endless waves of Soviet armor, King Tigers fought desperate rearguard actions outside Warsaw, Poznan, and finally, Berlin. They destroyed dozens of T-34s and IS-2s, but it didn't matter. The Red Army simply rolled over them with numbers the Germans couldn't hope to match. Soviet tankers learned to avoid frontal duels. They'd encircle, cut off, and bombard the King Tigers until the crew was forced to abandon ship. Many were destroyed not by enemy fire, but by their own charges, blown up to keep them out of Soviet hands. The streets of Germany were now littered with their hulks. Some stood abandoned in small villages, others half buried in mud near railway crossings, monuments to the futility of a war already lost. Yet even in their ruin they inspired awe. Allied soldiers would climb onto their massive hulls, posing for photos, amazed that something so massive could exist, and that it could be defeated at all. For the men who built them, it was a bitter end. The engineers who once dreamed of invincible machines were now refugees, their factories bombed to rubble. In the spring of 1945, one of the last King Tigers rolled out of Kassel. It never reached the front. Its crew abandoned it after just 20 kilometers, out of fuel, out of time. The era of the Tiger had ended. The King Tiger was born from ambition and ended in exhaustion. Too heavy to move, too late to matter. It was the perfect weapon for a nation that no longer existed. And as the Allies marched into the heart of Germany, the last of the giants sat silent by the roadside, its cannon aimed at nothing, its crew long gone, its empire in ashes. The legend had died, not in battle, but in stillness. When the war ended, the fields of Europe were silent, but the King Tigers still stood. Hulking wrecks of steel scattered across forests, villages, and river crossings. Their turrets twisted at odd angles, their tracks snapped, their barrels pointing uselessly toward the sky. To Allied soldiers walking past them, these machines were a paradox, terrifying and majestic even in defeat. Some men couldn't resist climbing onto them, posing for photos beside the shattered giants that had once dominated the battlefield. In places like La Glaise, Stavelo, and Budapest, villagers stared at the abandoned monsters that had appeared in their streets like creatures from another world. Children whispered stories about the German beast that could crush a house. The myth of the Königstiger, the King Tiger, was already being born. Allied intelligence teams began studying the wrecks in detail. Engineers measured the armor, tested the guns, and marveled at the precision of the craftsmanship. American reports described the 80 mm KW-43 as the finest tank gun of the war, capable of piercing any Allied armor at twice the range of a Sherman. But they also noted its fatal flaws. Too heavy for bridges, too slow for retreat, too complex for field repairs. The British called it a triumph of engineering and a failure of practicality. The Soviets were blunter. It is not a tank for war, it is a tank for a parade. Yet despite these criticisms, fascination grew. The Allies had crushed the Reich, but the King Tiger had earned their respect. It represented a level of ambition that, even in defeat, impressed those who studied it. In captured photos and news reels, the tank became a symbol, not of victory, but of awe. Its massive silhouette appeared in magazines, documentaries, and war reports across the world. For many, it embodied the paradox of Nazi Germany, a nation capable of building wonders, yet doomed by its obsession with perfection. Some of the surviving tanks were shipped to proving grounds in the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. There, they were dissected piece by piece. American engineers tested the gun. Soviet crews ran trials in muddy fields to see if the legend held up. It did, and it didn't. The gun was unmatched. The armor was nearly invincible. But once it left the test track, everything that had plagued it in war came roaring back. Overheating, broken transmissions, engines bursting into flame. One Soviet engineer reportedly laughed after a trial near Kubinka. Yes, it can kill anything, but it can't reach the battlefield. By 1946, most King Tigers had been scrapped. The few that survived were preserved for study or as trophies, relics of a defeated empire. Yet, as the Cold War began, the legend only grew. The king tiger became a ghost of what if? What if Germany had built more or had fuel to move them? The truth, of course, was simpler and sadder. The king tiger wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a monument to failure disguised as strength, proof that brilliance and madness can coexist in the same blueprint. Even today, in museums like Bovington or Kubinka, visitors still pause before its massive frame. The king tiger towers above them, rusted yet magnificent, and for a moment, they feel what the soldiers of 1944 must have felt: fear, wonder, disbelief. The steel is cold now. The engine will never roar again. But the legend endures, because the king tiger wasn't just a weapon, it was a warning, carved in armor, forged in desperation, and left behind as a reminder of how far ambition can go when it stops listening to reason. The war had ended, but the story of the king tiger was only beginning. Across the ruins of Europe, its carcasses lay half buried in mud and snow, silent witnesses to a war that had consumed millions. Soviet soldiers stood on their holes, smoking, posing for photos, laughing in disbelief at the idea that anyone thought these monsters could stop them. For them, the Königsteiger was not terrifying. It was proof of victory, a beast tamed. Yet for the rest of the world, the legend took root in a different way. Engineers, historians, and dreamers began to speak of the Tiger II as something more than a machine, a glimpse into the edge of human ambition. The tank that represented both the peak of German engineering and the depth of its delusion. In museums, when visitors first stood before one, they often fell silent. The sheer scale of it, the thickness of the armor, the length of the barrel, the brutal geometry, demanded respect. Even stripped of context, it radiated power. But behind that steel was a story of exhaustion. Each tank had taken thousands of man-hours to build, draining resources Germany could not afford. Every plate of armor forged meant fewer rifles, fewer trucks, fewer supplies for soldiers at the front. The King Tiger was a masterpiece, but it was also a monument to waste. In the years after the war, as nations rebuilt, the lessons of the Tiger II quietly shaped the next generation of tanks. Designers learned that mobility, reliability, and logistics mattered more than raw power. From the ashes of its failure came the blueprint for the modern battle tank: balanced, efficient, and adaptable. The King Tiger had shown the world what not to do, and, in a strange way, that made it even more important. During the Cold War, when tensions once again threatened to ignite, the image of the Tiger II appeared in military briefings and intelligence reports. Soviet and NATO planners studied its mistakes as they designed their own armored forces. In its shadow were born the T-62, the M-60, the Leopard, tanks that combined firepower with speed, something the Tiger could never achieve. But beyond blueprints and battlefields, the King Tiger became something else entirely: a symbol. For some, it represented the terrifying genius of German engineering. For others, it was a cautionary tale of arrogance and obsession. And for many veterans, it remained a memory: the shape of fear glimpsed through smoke on a distant ridge, the thunder of an 88mm gun echoing through their dreams. Decades later, those memories turned into myths. Model makers, filmmakers, and storytellers resurrected the King Tiger as an icon of unstoppable power. In movies and games, it became larger than life, faster, deadlier, almost invincible. The reality was far messier, but the myth was unstoppable. The truth, though, is written not in legend but in rust. Visit any surviving king tiger today, in Bovington, Saumur, or Kubinka, and you'll find silence. The air smells of oil and age. The armor is cold to the touch, scarred by time and battle. The massive gun points nowhere. Stand close enough, and you can still see the marks of the welders, the numbers etched into steel by hands that once believed they were forging history. In a sense, they did, because the king tiger endures not as a weapon of conquest, but as a relic of human contradiction. Proof that our greatest achievements often rise hand in hand with our greatest failures. It was the tank that terrified the Allies, drained its creators, and outlived its own empire. A monument of ambition turned to ruin. And yet, all these years later, when light hits its armor just right, you can still imagine it alive, rumbling through the mist, its engine growling, the earth trembling beneath its treads. Not a monster, not a hero, just a machine, a legend born from steel and silence.